There is a specific kind of confusion that doesn't feel like confusion. It feels like standing in a room where everyone else seems to know where they're going, and you've somehow missed the announcement that explained the exits. You're not lost in the chaotic sense. You can name things. You can function. You can get through a day. What you can't locate is the direction. Not because nothing is pointing at you, but because everything is pointing at you at once, from every angle, and none of it agrees on where you're supposed to end up. If you're a man born somewhere between the mid-90s and the early 2000s, that feeling probably has a specific texture. You know, with unusual clarity, what you are not supposed to be. The list was delivered early, often, and from every direction, through school, through culture, through every platform you grew up inside. But if someone asked you directly, right now, out loud, what a man in your generation is actually supposed to want to build, to become, the honest answer is harder to produce than it should be. Not because you haven't thought about it, because the material to think with was never clearly handed to you. Here's what nobody says with enough precision. That difficulty is not a character flaw. It is the predictable output of developing a male identity inside a specific cultural window, one that delivered the most complete public dismantling of the previous masculinity script in living memory, and almost nothing in architectural terms for what should come next. The psychology of what that specific absence produces in young men's development has a name, and the data on it is more precise than most people realize. The numbers arrive before the explanation does. According to data from a National Center for Education Statistics, women now outnumber men in American higher education by a ratio approaching 60-40, the widest gap on record, one that has continued to expand for more than a decade. Among young men under 30, the American Psychological Association Stress in America research has documented rising rates of purposelessness and identity uncertainty, patterns that don't map onto the stress profiles of previous male generational cohorts in the same way. These aren't unconnected data points. They are describing the same underlying condition from different angles. A generation of young men having genuine difficulty locating themselves, not in the geography of their lives, but in the architecture of who they are supposed to become. To understand how that happened, you have to go back to what previous generations of men were handed. Picture this. It's 1987. You're a 12-year-old boy. The script exists before you can read it. Your father worked with his hands or wore a tie, and that was the first chapter. Somewhere down the line, you'd find a job, build something, provide for something, protect something. The script didn't ask your opinion. It was already running when you arrived. It contained specific instructions about silence and toughness, and the ways men were supposed to occupy space and absorb difficulty without commentary. Many of those instructions were wrong. Some were genuinely damaging to the men who followed them and to everyone around them. But here's what a script provides, even a deeply flawed one: coordinates. You know where you're supposed to stand. You can accept the coordinates, reject them, push against them, but you have something concrete to navigate against. The map exists. You can argue with a map. What you cannot do is navigate without one. Gen X men inherited that script with the cracks already visible. Older millennials inherited it in its final years, watching it erode in real time. Gen Z men arrived and found the rubble, and then were expected to figure out what to build from it. Between approximately 2012 and 2020, something happened in the public conversation about masculinity that had no real precedent in its speed or its reach. The critique had been building in academic circles for decades. Psychologist Joseph Pleck had formalized what he called the gender role strain paradigm as early as 1981, documenting how rigid adherence to traditional masculine norms produces measurable psychological harm in the men who hold them, not only in the people around them. That finding mattered. But in the early 2010s, that scholarly conversation moved into mainstream cultural circulation faster than any of the underlying institutions, schools, families, media, had a framework to absorb. What young men encountered was not a gradual revision of the script. It was a public demolition, delivered primarily through the same social media platforms where they were simultaneously in the process of forming their identities in real time. In 2017, the global health organization Promundo published its Man Box research, a study examining the beliefs young men held about masculinity across the United States, the United Kingdom, and Mexico. What the data showed was significant and consistent across all three countries. Men who most strongly adhered to traditional masculine norms, beliefs about self-sufficiency, emotional restriction, toughness as a baseline requirement, reported worse mental health outcomes, higher rates of loneliness, more involvement in violence, and more psychological distress than men who didn't hold those norms as tightly. The following year, the American Psychological Association issued its first-ever formal guidelines for psychological practice with boys and men, identifying traditional masculinity ideology as associated with harm across a range of measurable outcomes. The guidelines themselves were careful, documented, and grounded in peer-reviewed research. What reached a 14-year-old scrolling through social media in 2018 was not always careful or nuanced. The message that arrived through the compressed and accelerated transmission of the algorithm was clear on one axis and almost entirely silent on the other. What you have been told about being a man causes harm. What to be instead? The conversation was considerably less certain. Here's what the developmental psychology actually says about what that specific asymmetry produces in a developing male identity. Erik Erikson mapped the stages of human psychological development across the lifespan, and the stage corresponding to adolescence and early adulthood, roughly the span from 14 to 24, is what he called the identity versus role confusion crisis. It is the developmental window in which a person is supposed to explore, test, and eventually commit to a stable sense of who they are. Psychologist James Marcia extended Erikson's framework in the 1960s and defined 4 distinct identity statuses describing where a person might be within that process. The status most relevant here is what Marcia called identity moratorium, an extended period of active exploration without commitment, in which the person tries on different possibilities, different versions of themselves, without settling on any of them. In healthy development, moratorium is a phase. It has a beginning and it has an end. What decades of research following Marcia's original work have consistently shown is that when a moratorium extends without resolving, when the exploration continues indefinitely without arriving at a stable foundation, the psychological cost accumulates with it. Not dramatically, quietly, in the form of chronic uncertainty that colors ordinary decisions, difficulty sustaining commitment when it requires choosing one thing and setting others aside, and a specific, sourceless anxiety that doesn't attach to any particular threat, because the threat is the absence of ground beneath you. For Gen Z men, the identity moratorium arrived at the exact developmental window when a cultural script for male identity was being publicly dismantled. The exploration was supposed to happen against some kind of structure, even an imperfect and contested one, that could serve as a reference point for negotiation. Instead, it happened inside a vacuum that was being actively maintained from multiple directions at once. And into that vacuum, the algorithm moved. Researchers Jonathan Haidt and Jean Twenge have each documented, through different methodologies and large-scale data sets, how the social media environment Gen Z adolescents developed inside differs fundamentally from anything previous generations encountered during identity formation. But for young men specifically, there was a pattern within the larger pattern. When the cultural conversation demolished the old script without providing a clear successor, the attention economy filled the space with the 2 loudest available alternatives. Hardline traditionalism on one side, a return to the previous script presented with urgency, as though the demolition had either not happened or had been unjustified, and a progressive deconstruction on the other, one that was considerably more articulate about what was wrong with the old framework than about what should be constructed to replace it. Both positions were available in infinite and algorithmically curated supply. Both were optimized for engagement, and both offered the one thing that developmental psychology predicts a young man in extended identity moratorium will find almost impossible to resist: certainty. A place to stand. An answer that ended the searching. The men who built large audiences selling that certainty from either ideological direction understood something about this psychology that most institutions didn't stop to name. A young man in the middle of an unresolved identity moratorium isn't primarily searching for the correct answer. He is searching for the relief of having any answer at all, a framework that ends the uncertainty, even an incoherent one, even one that requires ignoring significant evidence to maintain, offers something this generation has rarely been given: the sensation of knowing where to stand. That sensation is not the same as actually knowing. It doesn't produce the stability that comes from resolving an identity moratorium through actual experience. But from the inside, in the middle of that developmental window, the difference is genuinely difficult to feel until long after it has mattered. Here is what I want to say directly to you. If you're a Gen Z man and this landed somewhere specific, if you recognize the confusion not as evidence of something wrong with you, but as something structurally built into the moment you happen to be developing inside, hear this precisely. The developmental psychology is not describing a broken generation. It is describing a generation that went through a real identity formation process inside an environment that removed the reference points before new ones had a chance to form in their place. The demolition of the old script was, in significant ways, necessary. The absence of what should have followed it is the actual problem. And neither of those facts is yours to carry as personal evidence of inadequacy. What the research on identity development consistently shows, from Marsh's original work forward, is that stable identity doesn't arrive through ideology. It doesn't arrive through adopting the correct framework or settling on the right position in a cultural argument about what masculinity should mean. It arrives through a different mechanism entirely, through action, through commitment to something specific enough to produce real and honest feedback over time. A skill practice past the point of early competence and into the territory where it starts telling you something true about yourself. A relationship held through its difficult stretches. A discipline maintained past the point where you're still waiting to feel ready. What Marsh's research documented precisely is this: identity forms not through thinking your way to clarity, but through doing something real and letting the doing, the accumulated concrete experience of trying and failing and returning, teach you who you are. That process is slower than an algorithm. It is less immediately satisfying than a framework. It does not provide the relief of a fast answer, but it is the only mechanism that produces a foundation that actually holds when the next thing arrives to dismantle it. Every generation of man before yours was handed coordinates. Some of those coordinates led somewhere real and worthwhile. Many led to damage that took generations to name and begin to repair. You were handed the absence. That is a harder starting position. It is also, eventually, the only position from which you build something that actually belongs to you, rather than a script written before you arrived that you have been trying to perform convincingly from memory. If this gave language to something you've been carrying, say in the comments. Not for me, because naming the mechanism is usually the first thing that makes it less heavy. And if you know a Gen Z man who has been operating inside this confusion and couldn't locate why, send this without explanation. Sometimes that's the whole conversation. Like this if it reached somewhere real. I'll see you in the next one.